I watched Sarah walking toward me in her white dress, bouquet trembling slightly in her hands. She looked beautiful. The December sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the wooden floor. Everything was perfect, except for one thing. When I glanced at my side of the church, 3 entire rows sat completely empty. Not a single coat draped over a chair. Not a single familiar face turning to smile. My father wasn't there. My brothers Marcus and Tyler weren't there. The people who raised me, who I thought would always be there, had abandoned me on the most important day of my life. And right then, a woman 2 rows back whispered to her husband, just loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Why didn't anyone from the groom's family show up? What kind of person gets married alone? My name is James, and that whisper cut deeper than any knife could. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have possibly understood as I stood at that altar trying not to fall apart, was that the empty chairs were just the opening move. What my family did after my wedding, the criminal accusations they filed, the evidence they fabricated, the conspiracy they built to frame me for stealing $47,000, would make that abandoned ceremony look like an act of kindness. And it all started 4 years earlier with a decision I made in 30 seconds that my father would never forgive. The wildfire started on a Tuesday in Boulder, Colorado. The kind of fire that moves faster than you can run, consuming everything in its path with a hunger that feels almost alive. I was 26 years old, working as a paramedic, and my father had just retired after 23 years as a firefighter. Our family property sat on 5 acres outside town, surrounded by dry grass and pine trees that became fuel the second the first ember touched them. The evacuation warning came at 2:47 p.m. By 3:15, we could see flames cresting the ridge above our house, moving downhill like a burning avalanche. My father was in the yard, his face red, veins bulging in his neck as he screamed at me over the roar of wind and crackling timber. He pointed at the storage shed behind the main house, where he kept his vintage 1987 ambulance, the one he'd spent 15 years restoring. That ambulance wasn't just a vehicle. It was his identity. Every weekend for over a decade, he'd worked on it, polishing chrome, replacing parts, making it pristine. He'd turned down offers of $30,000 from collectors because it meant more to him than money ever could. And now, with flames racing toward us, he was screaming at me to save it. His exact words, burned into my memory forever, were, "Get that ambulance out right now, James. Everything I am is in that shed. Don't you dare let it burn." I started running toward the shed. My hand was literally on the door handle when I heard it. A child's scream, high-pitched and absolutely terrified, cutting through the roar of the fire like a siren. It came from the small rental cabin at the north edge of our property, a place my father had been fixing up to generate extra income. The cabin was already surrounded by smoke. Flames were licking at the dry grass around its foundation, moving closer with every second. I stood frozen for maybe 3 seconds. My father screaming about the ambulance behind me. That child screaming for help in front of me. And I had to choose. Here's what they don't tell you about moments like that. Your training takes over before your brain catches up. I'd spent 5 years as a paramedic. 5 years running toward emergencies while everyone else ran away. 5 years learning that you save human lives first and you worry about everything else later. So I let go of that shed door and I sprinted toward the cabin. The heat was so intense it felt like running into a wall. Smoke filled my lungs, burning my throat, making my eyes stream with tears. I kicked the cabin door open, the wood splintering under my boot, and found a boy maybe 7 years old huddled under a table, crying so hard he was choking. I grabbed him, pulled him against my chest, and ran back out just as part of the cabin's roof collapsed behind us in an explosion of sparks and burning debris. I carried that kid across the yard, both of us coughing, my lungs screaming, and I looked up to see my father standing exactly where I'd left him. Our eyes met across that smoky yard, and what I saw in his face wasn't relief. It wasn't gratitude that a child's life had been saved. It was pure, ice-cold betrayal. Behind him, the storage shed was completely engulfed in flames. The ambulance, his pride, his proof that his life had meant something, was burning. And in that single moment, I watched my father decide that I had chosen wrong. The boy's parents arrived 20 minutes later, crying, thanking me over and over while I stood there covered in ash and soot, my throat raw from smoke inhalation. My father didn't say a single word to me. Not that day, not that week, not for months. but I heard what he told my brothers. The words got back to me through family friends, through neighbors, spreading like their own kind of fire through every relationship I had. He told Marcus and Tyler that I had betrayed our family, that I had let his life's work burn because I cared more about strangers than my own blood, that I had made a choice that proved I wasn't really one of them anymore. My brother Marcus, who was 29 and had always worshipped our father, believed him instantly. Tyler, who was 24 and usually questioned things, took longer to fall in line, but eventually he did too. In my family, loyalty was everything. And according to my father, I had committed the ultimate sin. What I didn't know then, what wouldn't come out until much later, was that the ambulance wasn't just sentimental. 3 weeks after the fire, old Mrs. Chun, the neighbor who had lived down the road for 40 years and knew everyone's business, pulled me aside at the grocery store. She looked uncomfortable, kept glancing around like she was worried someone would overhear. Then she told me something that changed everything. My father had taken out a massive loan against the property 8 months before the fire. He'd been struggling financially for years, making bad investments, gambling more than he should, and the debt had piled up until he was drowning. The vintage ambulance was listed as primary collateral for the loan because of its appraised value as a fully restored emergency vehicle. Without it, the loan terms changed immediately. The interest rate jumped from 6% to 18%. The payment schedule accelerated. And my father, who was already barely keeping his head above water, suddenly found himself in a financial hole he had no way to climb out of. Mrs. Chin told me she thought I deserved to know because the family was blaming me for things that weren't my fault. But knowing didn't help. If anything, it made everything worse. Because now I understood that my father didn't just see me as someone who had disobeyed him. He saw me as the person who had destroyed his last chance at financial stability. He saw me as the reason his life was falling apart. And that kind of resentment doesn't fade with time. It grows. It festers. It turns into something poisonous. For the next 4 years, my relationship with my family existed in this strange, painful limbo. We didn't have screaming fights. We just had distance. Cold, deliberate, carefully maintained distance. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. When I did call, conversations felt forced, filled with long silences and topics we carefully avoided. Holiday gatherings turned awkward. I'd show up to Thanksgiving or Christmas, and my brothers would barely acknowledge me. My father would look through me like I was invisible. Nobody said anything directly cruel, but the message was clear. I wasn't welcome anymore. I tried to fix it. God, I tried everything. I wrote letters that went unanswered. I showed up at family dinners where I clearly wasn't wanted, sitting at the table while everyone talked around me like I wasn't there. I apologized for letting the ambulance burn, even though I knew, deep in my soul, that I would make the exact same choice again because that was a child's life. But nothing worked. The wall between us just kept getting higher and thicker until it felt like we were living in completely different worlds. Then I met Sarah. She was an ER nurse at Denver General, tough and compassionate in equal measure, with this way of seeing through people's defenses that should have scared me, but somehow felt safe instead. We met when I brought in a car accident victim, and she challenged my treatment protocol right there in the trauma bay in front of everyone. Turned out she was right, and I was wrong. And instead of being embarrassed, I was impressed. 6 months later, after a particularly brutal 16-hour shift where we'd lost 2 patients and saved 3 others, I asked her to marry me in the hospital parking lot. Both of us were still in our scrubs, exhausted, smelling like disinfectant and sweat. She said yes before I even finished the question, and I felt happier in that moment than I had in 4 years. When we started planning the wedding, Sarah asked about my family. I told her the truth. That things were complicated, that we weren't close anymore, that there was history I didn't want to get into, but I still wanted to invite them. She looked at me with those sharp, knowing eyes and asked if I was really sure that was a good idea. I said I had to try. I said maybe a wedding could be the thing that brought us back together. I said I wanted to believe that family meant something more than old grudges and burned ambulances. So 8 months before the ceremony, I sent out the wedding invitations. I hand-wrote a note to my father, 3 pages long, telling him that despite everything that had happened, despite the distance and the silence and the hurt, I wanted him there. I wanted him to be part of this new chapter of my life. I wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, love could be stronger than resentment. The invitation came back exactly 1 week later, unopened. The envelope was bent and wrinkled, with a postal stamp that said, "Return to sender," stamped across the front in red ink. But what really shattered something inside me was the text message that came that same afternoon. From my father. For words that felt like a punch to the gut. "Don't expect anything from us." I sat in my apartment staring at those words for so long that Sarah came home from her shift and found me in the same position, phone still in my hand, the unopened envelope on the table in front of me. She didn't ask questions. She just sat next to me and put her hand on my shoulder, and we stayed like that until the sun went down and the room got dark. I should have known then that the rejection wasn't just about the wedding. I should have recognized the warning signs of something bigger brewing beneath the surface. But I was too hurt, too focused on the pain of being abandoned by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, to see what was really happening. The wedding day came anyway. Sarah looked absolutely beautiful. The chapel was perfect. The flowers were arranged exactly how we'd planned. The music was beautiful. Everything came together exactly right, except for those 3 empty rows on my side. Except for the whispers. Except for the way I had to stand there and pretend my heart wasn't breaking while I promised to love and cherish Sarah for the rest of my life. During the reception, Sarah's Uncle Frank came up to me. He was ex-military, the kind of man who said exactly what he meant without sugarcoating anything. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "I don't know what happened with your family, son, but the fact that you're standing here, that you went through with this day anyway, that tells me everything I need to know about your character. You're going to be just fine." I thanked him, but his words felt hollow. Because standing there without my family didn't feel like strength. It felt like failure. It felt like proof that I had broken something fundamental that could never be repaired. The honeymoon helped. 2 weeks in Costa Rica where Sarah and I could pretend the outside world didn't exist. We hiked through rainforests, swam in waterfalls, ate fresh seafood on the beach. And for those 2 weeks, I almost forgot about the empty chairs and the returned invitation and the text message that had cut so deep. But the moment we got back to Denver, reality came crashing down harder than I could have imagined. There was a thick manila envelope waiting in our mailbox. Official looking. Legal. With a red wax seal across the back that made my stomach drop before I even opened it. Inside was a court summons. My name was listed as the defendant in a civil case involving misappropriation of family savings. The plaintiff was my father. The amount allegedly stolen was $47,000. I read that document 3 times, certain I was misunderstanding something. The claim stated that I had illegally accessed a savings account belonging to my deceased mother and transferred funds without authorization to my personal accounts. But I had never even known such an account existed. My mother had died 6 years earlier from cancer. As far as I knew, the medical bills had consumed every penny she had. We'd sold her car, her jewelry, everything of value just to cover the costs. There was nothing left. Or so I thought. The court document demanded that I provide GPS logs, work schedules, and witness statements for October 14th, 3 months before my wedding. According to the filing, multiple witnesses had reported seeing me near my father's property on that date. Security footage allegedly showed someone matching my description breaking into his home. The implications were clear. They were accusing me of physically stealing from my own father's house. My hands were shaking as I showed the papers to Sarah. Her face went pale as she read through them. She worked in healthcare, she understood legal documents, and she could see immediately that this wasn't just a misunderstanding or a mistake. This was a carefully constructed accusation. Someone had spent time building a case against me, complete with specific dates, alleged evidence, and witness statements designed to hold up in court. The next morning I called a lawyer. Her name was Patricia Odom, and she had a reputation for handling complex family disputes. She reviewed the documents during our first meeting, her expression getting more serious with every page. Finally, she looked up at me and said something that made my blood run cold. "James, this isn't someone acting on anger or impulse. This is planned. This is coordinated. Whoever filed this complaint spent considerable time and effort building a narrative. The question we need to answer is why. What do they actually want?" I didn't have an answer. But over the next week, the attacks escalated in ways I never could have anticipated. I started receiving text messages from unknown numbers. Dozens of them. All demanding that I return the money I'd stolen. Then came the voicemails. Some angry, some threatening, all insisting that I was a thief who had betrayed my family when they needed me most. One voicemail came with an audio attachment. When I played it, I heard my brother Marcus's voice, slurred and furious, saying things about me that made it clear he believed every word of the accusations. He called me a parasite. He said I'd always been selfish. He said the family should have cut me off years ago. Hearing my own brother talk about me like that, with such pure hatred in his voice, felt like being gutted. Sarah and I started going through my mother's old papers, documents I'd kept in storage but never really examined closely. That's when we found the pattern. 2 separate bank accounts had been opened in my mother's name approximately 8 months before she died. Both accounts showed regular withdrawals over the following years, continuing even after her death. The withdrawals lined up almost perfectly with periods when my brothers were struggling financially. When Marcus lost his job 3 years ago, there was a withdrawal of $8,000. When Tyler's business failed 2 years ago, there was a withdrawal of $12,000. The math wasn't subtle. Someone had been using my mother's accounts as a personal ATM, taking money whenever they needed it. And now they needed someone to blame. Then we found a specific transaction that changed everything. A transfer of $900, dated October 14th, the exact date mentioned in the court filing. The transfer was supposedly made by me, from my mother's account to mine. But when Sarah, who was better with technology than I was, dug into the digital footprint, she found something crucial. The IP address for that transaction traced back to a bar called Rusty Bluff, a dive bar on the outskirts of Boulder where my brother Marcus spent most of his free time. At the exact time that transfer was made, according to my FEMA work logs, I was over 100 miles away, knee-deep in floodwater, helping evacuate families from a disaster zone. There was no possible way I could have made that transaction. Someone had staged it. Someone had deliberately created evidence to frame me. Later that same week, I found a handwritten note tucked between bills in my mailbox. The handwriting was immediately familiar. The curve of the letters, the rushed angles, the way certain words slanted to the right. It was my brother Tyler's handwriting, the same handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists for years. The note was short, direct, threatening. It said if I didn't cooperate, if I didn't return what I'd taken, things would get much worse for me. My career would be destroyed. My reputation would be ruined. I'd lose everything. The same handwriting, I realized with growing horror, had appeared on several documents in the court filing. Tyler wasn't just passively involved. He was actively participating in building the case against me. The truth settled over me with brutal, crushing clarity. This wasn't one person acting alone. This wasn't just my father being angry about an ambulance that burned 4 years ago. This was a coordinated conspiracy. My father and both my brothers were working together, building a version of reality where I was the villain, where I was the thief, where I was the one who had betrayed the family. And standing there on my porch, reading that threatening note in my brother's handwriting, I realized something that made me feel physically sick. They weren't doing this because they were angry at me. They were doing this because they were desperate. They'd been stealing from my mother's accounts for years, and now someone, maybe a bank, maybe a lawyer handling her estate, was asking questions. They needed a scapegoat. They needed someone to take the blame. And I was the perfect target because I'd already been cast out of the family. Who would believe me over all 3 of them? At exactly 7:15 on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the court summons arrived, someone started pounding on my door. Denver was buried under fresh snow from an overnight storm. The kind of snow that makes everything look clean and peaceful and innocent. But the moment I opened that door, every muscle in my body went rigid. My father stood between 2 Jefferson County police officers, snow melting off his coat, his face set like stone. For just a heartbeat, maybe half a second, I thought he'd come to talk, to apologize, to explain. He didn't. He looked at the officers and told them he wanted to report me for breaking and entering. He said I'd broken into his home, stolen property, and he had video evidence to prove it. It felt like the floor tilted sideways. One of the officers, a young guy who looked fresh out of the academy, asked me to step outside. The cold hit me immediately. I was barefoot, wearing only sweatpants and a t-shirt, and the snow burned against my skin. My father handed over a tablet showing grainy security footage from his backyard. The timestamp read October 14th, 11:47 p.m. The video showed a hooded figure moving quickly across the yard, trying door handles, eventually disappearing around the side of the house. The officer looked at the video, then looked at me, comparing my height and build to the figure on screen. He said the resemblance was definitely there. My cheeks burned despite the freezing cold. My own father was standing there watching police officers examine me like a criminal, and his expression showed absolutely nothing. No doubt, no conflict, just cold certainty that I was guilty. I forced myself to stay calm. I went inside, grabbed my phone, and pulled up my FEMA GPS tracking logs. Every emergency responder in Colorado has their location tracked during active duty for safety and coordination. The logs showed exactly where I'd been on October 14th. From 6 p.m. until 2 a.m. the following morning, I'd been more than 100 miles away at a flood rescue operation in Greeley. The timestamps were precise, verified by satellite, impossible to fake. One of the officers, an older woman with gray hair and sharp eyes, nodded as she reviewed the data. She said the GPS evidence was pretty conclusive, but my father immediately said I could have hired someone else to do it. I could have paid someone to break in while I was away to make it look like I had an alibi. Even the officers looked surprised by how far he was willing to stretch the accusation. Then the older officer asked about physical evidence. She said they'd found shoe prints in the yard near where the figure had been walking. She asked what size shoe I wore. I told her size 9. She and her partner exchanged a look. The shoe prints, she said, were size 12, a full 3 sizes larger than my feet. My father hesitated. For the first time, I saw a crack in his certainty. He muttered something about having visitors, about how other people used that yard. But that tiny hesitation, that momentary pause, told me more truth than anything he'd said all morning. The final crack in his story came when the officers asked him a simple question. How had he accessed the security camera footage? My mother had set up the camera system years before she died. She'd created all the passwords, managed all the accounts. My father, who could barely operate a smartphone, had never remembered any of the login information. Yet here he was, presenting video footage he'd supposedly downloaded himself. When pressed, he admitted Marcus had sent him the file. The officers asked to see the original footage, not the edited clip. They examined the metadata, the digital fingerprint that shows when a file was created, modified, and transferred. The video had passed through 3 different devices before reaching my father's tablet. The warped metadata showed signs of editing, timestamps that didn't quite line up. And there was something else. The hooded figure in the video was wearing a specific type of beanie, a bright red one with a white logo. The older officer zoomed in on the logo. It was from a sporting goods store called Peak Outfitters. She asked if I'd ever shopped there. I said no. She asked my father if he knew anyone who had. He said no. But I knew. Peak Outfitters had exactly one location in Colorado, and it was in a strip mall directly next to Rusty Bluff. The bar where Marcus spent most of his time. The bar where the financial transaction had been traced. My father couldn't look at me after that. His gaze fixed somewhere past my shoulder, like meeting my eyes would shatter whatever story he'd convinced himself was true. Standing there with snow soaking through my socks, I understood with perfect clarity that my family had orchestrated the entire thing. They'd created false evidence. They'd staged a break-in. They'd edited security footage. They'd filed legal documents they knew were lies. They wanted those officers to leave with me in handcuffs. They'd come so close to succeeding. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought maybe exposure would make them back off, that seeing their manufactured evidence fall apart would force them to stop. Instead, the attacks escalated. A new blow landed before noon that same day. I received an email from FEMA, my employer, the organization I'd dedicated 6 years of my life to. A formal complaint had been filed against me, accusing me of misusing internal databases and accessing confidential information for personal gain. My Level 4 security clearance was suspended immediately, pending a full investigation. One email, and suddenly my entire career was hanging by a thread. Sarah studied the attached complaint form that night. She recognized the handwriting immediately. The slanted letters with heavy pressure on every Y. The strange loop on every L. It was Tyler's handwriting. My younger brother, the one I'd taught to ride a bike, the one I'd helped with homework, the one I'd thought might eventually come to his senses, was actively trying to destroy my career. Later that week, a coworker I trusted pulled me aside during lunch. She told me someone had called the FEMA office 3 times over the past month, asking detailed questions about my disciplinary history, my performance reviews, anything that could potentially be used against me. My father had always believed that a person's past was the easiest weapon to use against them. Hearing that he'd turned that philosophy on his own son made my stomach turn. But the sharpest blow came 2 days later. A hospital billing statement showed up in my mailbox, addressed to my mother even though she'd been dead for 6 years. The bill was for a recent medical procedure. The payment, over $3,000, had been processed through a bank account under my name, an account I'd never opened. Someone had stolen my identity, created financial accounts in my name, built a paper trail of transactions I'd never made, and handed it all over as evidence of my supposed crimes. That evening, Sarah pulled up our home security footage. She'd installed cameras after the threatening notes started arriving, wanting some way to monitor who was coming to our door. What she found made both of us go cold. Marcus appeared in the footage twice, both times late at night, both times standing under the street lamp directly across from our apartment, staring at our window, phone in his hand. Both visits had happened in the week before the court summons arrived. Sarah's voice was quiet when she said what we were both thinking. They'd planned this from the very beginning. This wasn't desperate people making impulsive decisions. This was a calculated, coordinated effort to frame me for crimes I didn't commit. And as I stared at my brother's blurred outline on the security footage, I understood something bitter and final. My family wasn't acting out of anger anymore. They were acting out of pure survival instinct. They were willing to drag me under, to destroy my life completely, if it meant keeping themselves afloat. I made a decision that night. I was going back to Boulder, back to the house where I grew up, back to the place I'd been avoiding for 4 years. Because somewhere in that house, somewhere in my mother's old papers and my father's records, there had to be evidence of what they'd really been doing. Driving back to Boulder felt like forcing myself into a nightmare I'd spent years trying to escape. The old house stood exactly where I'd left it, looking smaller somehow, more worn down. The fence was still scarred from the wildfire. The storage shed was still a burned-out husk. A cold wind slipped through the charred boards, carrying that faint, unmistakable smell of ash that never quite goes away. Stepping inside was like opening a door to a past I'd locked away in the deepest part of my mind. Nothing had changed, but everything felt different. The furniture was the same. The pictures on the walls were the same. But the house felt hollow, emptied of whatever warmth it had once held. In the kitchen, I opened the lowest cabinet, the one that had always stuck and required a hard pull to open. It let out the same familiar squeak it had made my entire childhood. Beneath a stack of old bills and junk mail, I found something I'd never seen before. A leather-bound notebook, the kind my mother used to use for keeping track of important information. I opened it, and my hands started shaking. Page after page listed loans. Personal loans, payday loans, credit cards, all opened in my mother's name. Each entry ended with the same handwritten note in her distinctive cursive. Marcus will repay. But he never had. She'd been hiding his debts for years, taking out new loans to cover old ones, spiraling deeper into financial disaster while protecting him from the consequences of his choices. Further back in the notebook, I found the same pattern with Tyler. Smaller amounts, but the same cycle of borrowing and never repaying. My mother had been drowning in debt created by my brothers, and she'd hidden it from everyone. The weight of what she'd protected, and what they'd taken, pressed against my chest like a physical force that I stepped outside, needing air, and Mr. Peterson from next door waved me over. He was 83 years old, had lived on this street for 50 years, and saw everything that happened in the neighborhood. He told me he'd seen strangers going in and out of the house for months. One woman in particular had stayed so long she practically lived there. He described her. Mid-30s, dark hair, drove a beat-up Honda Civic. I knew exactly who he was talking about. Marcus's ex-girlfriend, Elena. The pieces snapped into place with sickening clarity. The altered video. The wrong shoe size. The unfamiliar silhouette. The break-in hadn't been staged with some random person. They'd used Elena, someone who had keys to the house from when she and Marcus were together, someone who owed them money or favors, someone desperate enough to participate in framing me for a crime. I found Marcus later that night at Rusty Bluff, slumped against his car in the parking lot, drunk and barely able to stand. When he saw me, his face went through a series of expressions. Surprise, fear, guilt, defiance. I asked him one simple question. Why? And maybe it was the alcohol, or maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was relief at finally being confronted, but he told me everything. They'd been using Mom's accounts for years, he said. Small amounts at first, then larger ones as their debts grew. When she died, they thought the accounts would just disappear, absorbed into the estate and forgotten. But someone started asking questions. A bank auditor noticed irregular activity. A lawyer handling probate wanted documentation. They panicked. They needed someone to blame, and I was already the family outcast. Dad believed I owed them anyway, Marcus said, his words slurring together. Owed them for choosing a stranger over family, for letting the ambulance burn, for not being there when they needed money. In his mind, they were just taking what I should have given them voluntarily. The woman in the video, Marcus confirmed, was Elena. She'd used an old key. They'd promised to pay off her credit card debt if she helped them stage the break-in. They'd filmed it, edited the timestamp, made it look like I was there when I wasn't. It was supposed to be simple. File the complaint. I'd panic and maybe pay them off to make it go away, and everyone would move on. But I hadn't cooperated. I'd fought back. So they'd escalated, adding more false evidence, more accusations, trying to bury me under so much manufactured guilt that I'd have no choice but to give them what they wanted. Standing in that parking lot, listening to my brother confess to framing me for crimes I didn't commit, I felt something inside me finally break free. Not anger, though there was plenty of that. Not hatred, though I could have justified it. But clarity. Clear, cold understanding that the people I'd been trying to win back for 4 years were never coming back. They'd made their choice, and I needed to make mine. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late February. The Jefferson County Courthouse was a gray concrete building that looked exactly like what it was, a place where people's lives got dissected and judged. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glare over rows of wooden benches. The air smelled like paper and dust, and the accumulated anxiety of everyone who'd ever waited for a verdict. I stood before the panel with my lawyer Patricia beside me. Across the room, my father sat rigid in his seat, Marcus and Tyler hovering behind him like shadows, none of them willing to fully step forward into their own blame. When the proceedings began, the FEMA representative stepped forward with my GPS logs. The panel studied the data without expression, scrolling through timestamps that proved beyond any doubt that I'd been over 100 miles away during the alleged break-in. Their conclusion was swift and matter-of-fact. I could not have been anywhere near the scene. For the first time since this nightmare started, I saw a genuine doubt ripple through the room. A technical analyst took the stand next, pulling up the security footage my father had submitted. He explained in precise, clinical detail how the timestamp had been altered, how the metadata showed the file had been edited and transferred through multiple devices. The final device, he noted for the record, was registered to Marcus Thornton. My father shifted in his seat, his jaw tight, a tremor running through his shoulders as the panel turned their attention to him. I placed my mother's leather notebook on the evidence table. The panel leaned forward as I opened it, showing page after page of her handwriting documenting loans she'd taken to cover my brother's debts. Each entry ending with Marcus will repay or Tyler will repay. And at the bottom of the final page, a line that had crushed me the moment I first read it. Don't let James know. He'll try to help, and he's already given enough. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that comes when truth stops needing to argue its case. Then the officers brought in Elena Martinez, Marcus's ex-girlfriend. Her voice shook as she admitted that she'd crossed the yard that night wearing the hooded jacket and Marcus's oversized shoes. She'd used an old key she'd kept from when they were dating. They'd asked her to stage the break-in so they could claim I'd stolen the money. They'd offered to settle her debts in return. When she finished, you could have heard a pin drop in that courtroom. The panel took less than 10 minutes to issue their ruling. The accusations were completely false. The evidence was fabricated. I was cleared of every charge. The case file would be permanently closed and sealed. I turned toward them then. My father. My brothers. And I spoke the only words that still felt true. I never took anything from this family. I saved a child's life while you stood and watched your pride burn. Everything that's happened since then, every lie you've told, every piece of evidence you've faked, that's on you. I'm done trying to earn back something I never should have lost in the first place. I'm done carrying the blame for your choices. My father bowed his head. For the first time in 4 years, I saw him not as the strong firefighter who'd raised me, but as a man hollowed out by his own decisions, smaller than the ashes he'd once stood bravely against. 3 months after the hearing, Colorado finally exhaled into spring. Snow retreated up the mountains, revealing new grass underneath. Wildflowers pushed through the thawed earth like small acts of courage. Life felt quieter, lighter, as if the world had finally loosened its grip around my chest and let me breathe again. Sarah and I moved to a new apartment across town. Fresh start, fresh walls, no memories of threatening notes or security footage showing family members stalking us. Then something unexpected happened. I received a message from Emma, a young woman I'd mentored 2 years earlier when she was training to become a paramedic. Her father had died when she was 16, and I tried to be someone she could count on during her training. She was getting married, she said, and she wanted to know if I would walk her down the aisle. She said she wanted someone who had stood beside her when life was hardest, someone who'd shown up when it mattered. I said yes without hesitation, though familiar pains settled under my ribs as the day approached. When the church doors opened and the wedding march began, Emma slipped her arm through mine and leaned close. Her whisper was barely audible over the music, but it hit me harder than any court verdict ever could. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being the kind of person who stays. Those words wrapped around a part of me I hadn't realized was still wounded. Standing there in the warm glow of that church, watching Emma walk toward her future, it felt like someone handed back the piece of my own wedding day that had been stolen from me. Not replaced. You can't replace what's lost, but redeemed somehow, given new meaning. Outside after the ceremony, the sun stretched golden over the Rocky Mountains. I felt something I hadn't felt in 4 years. Not triumph, because there was nothing to triumph over. Not vengeance, because I'd never wanted that. Just peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you made the right choice even when it cost you everything. The kind of peace that comes from understanding that family isn't just the people you're born to. It's the people who show up. And I choose to be someone who shows up, even when, especially when, the people who raised me never did.